This video is sponsored by Cascade, a real-time organization and collaboration platform. Make sure to check the description for a discount on your subscription. Hey everyone, my name is Vishwas and welcome to the CSS Crash Course for complete beginners. In this crash course, we will take a look at the fundamentals of CSS. Before we begin, let me go over a few points to give you an idea of what this video is and what it is not. First, I would like to mention this course is for complete beginners. I'm going to assume you have no prior knowledge of CSS and teach the course. If you are someone who is already familiar with CSS, this is your cue to probably hop into another video where your time can be better utilized. Second, this video is a continuation of the HTML crash course. So make sure you're familiar with HTML before proceeding. Third, we're going to learn the fundamentals of CSS. CSS contains a plethora of concepts varying from simple syntax to advanced topics that are relatively more difficult to understand. We will focus on topics that a beginner must know when getting started with web development. You can then use that knowledge to add styles to your web pages based on your artistic knowledge. Very similar to how you learn the basics of a guitar string and then use that knowledge to play any song which you like. It is worth mentioning that some of the buzzwords that you might have heard, like Flexbox and CSS Grid, will be their own separate videos, and this video will just be about the fundamentals of CSS. Finally, unlike other videos in my channel, this video is a crash course and is longer in length. That doesn't mean you have to sit through the entire video at once. Take it easy, pause when necessary, and most importantly, make sure you code along with me, as that is the best way to learn. By the end of this video, you will have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of CSS. Alright, with these points in mind, let's get started. To work with CSS, similar to HTML, we need two things: a browser and a code editor. For browser, I'm going to be using Chrome. To write the CSS code, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. Head over to code.visualstudio.com and download the editor. Once you've installed, in the sidebar, click Extensions and install the Prettier Code Formatter extension. This extension will help with code formatting. Finally, open the editor inside a folder of your choice. I have created a folder called CSS Crash Course and I've opened VS Code inside the folder. Here, I'm going to create a new HTML file. index.html. Type exclamation and tab to generate a simple HTML document. Within the body tag, add an h1 tag that says CSS Crash Course. This pretty much is all the setup we have to do. If you reveal this file in File Explorer and open index.html in the browser, you should see the text as expected. Now we are ready to learn CSS. First, let us understand what is CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets and is the language used to style an HTML document. CSS is a style sheet language and not a programming language. With CSS, you control the layout of a web page, the spacing between elements, what color the text should be in, etc. And the way you do that is by selecting HTML elements and applying styles to those selected elements. And this is pretty much all you have to learn from a beginner point of view. How do I select an HTML element? And what styles can I apply to that selected element? In answering these two questions, you're effectively learning CSS. Let's begin with an example. For our first task, let's learn how to apply an orange color to the text we see in the browser. Now you might be surprised, but there are 3 different ways to add styles to an HTML document: inline styles, internal style sheet, and finally external style sheet. Let's understand each of them, starting with inline styles. Inline styles are CSS declarations that affect a single HTML element. To use inline styles, we add the style attribute to the relevant element. To apply an orange color to the h1 tag, we add the style attribute, and this is equal to what I mentioned as a CSS declaration a few seconds ago. A CSS declaration is a pair of property and its value. For our example, the property is color and the value is orange. We separate them with a colon. If we now save the file and refresh the browser, you can see the text is now in orange. Looks pretty simple, right? Well, let me tell you, although adding inline styles is pretty straightforward, whenever possible, you should avoid it. Unfortunately, applying inline styles is the opposite of CSS best practices. First, it is very difficult to maintain. Suppose you have this style on 10 different elements and there is a request to change orange to blue color. You then have to edit the code in 10 different places. The second reason is that with inline styles, you are mixing HTML content with presentational code, which is more difficult to read and understand. Separating them makes it easier for maintenance. Well, if it is bad, why are we learning it? Well, it does have some use case which you would come across in more complex applications. For example, styling HTML templates for emails, and perhaps styling content in a content management system. Now, these are pretty advanced from a beginner's point of view, so you don't have to worry about the use cases right now. All you have to make sure is you understand how to apply inline styles. Style attribute, property, value. Alright, the second way to add CSS is by using an internal style sheet. An internal style sheet is defined inside a pair of style HTML element within the head section of the document. So opening tag, style, and closing tag. Within the style block, we can specify CSS rules that get applied to the HTML elements. Which brings us to the syntax of a CSS rule. A CSS rule consists of a selector and a declaration block. The selector points to the HTML element you want to style. The declaration block contains one or more style declarations separated by semicolons. Each declaration has a property and a value. What you're seeing is the CSS rule we need to write within the style tag to color the h1 text in orange. Here, h1 is the selector and the declaration block is within curly braces. We specify the property, which is color, and its value, which is orange, separated by a colon. So back in VS Code, within the style tags, h1, property is color, and the value is orange. And let me format the code. Alt-Shift-F is the keyboard shortcut. If we now remove the inline style and refresh the browser, you can see the h1 tag is still orange colored. The inline style sheet is working as expected. What is happening here is the selector h1 selects all h1 tags in our document. We just have the one element, so the element is selected. To this element, the style specified is applied, which is orange color in our case. If we add a second h1 tag, another h1 element, refresh, you can see this is an orange as well. Hopefully, this CSS rule makes sense now. Now what you should know is that inline style sheet is also not the recommended approach to adding styles to an HTML document. They can be useful if you just have one web page, or perhaps if you're working with a content management system where you're blocked from modifying external CSS files. But for websites which contain more than one web page, an internal style sheet becomes less efficient. If you have to apply a uniform style to multiple HTML pages, you have to edit the style section in multiple files. Maintenance would be difficult. Which brings us to the third and final way to add CSS, which is external style sheet. An external style sheet contains CSS in a separate file with a .css extension. And the HTML page must include a reference to the external style sheet inside the head section with a link HTML element. Let me show how it works. First, we create a new file called styles.css. The .css extension is very important, and styles is sort of the convention as the file name. Now, all we have to do is move the CSS rule from the style block and put it inside the styles.css file. So h1, curly braces, color set to orange and a semicolon. Once we have the styles in place, we link this file with the HTML document. For that, within the head section, we add a link tag, and on this tag, we add two attributes. Relation is equal to style sheet, and href, which points to the CSS file. So styles.css. If we now save both the files and head back to the browser, refresh, and you should still see the text in orange color. Let me change orange to blue to make sure it's working. Refresh, and you can see the text is now in blue. So this is the external style sheet approach. Let me tell you, this approach is the most common and useful method of adding CSS to a document. You can link a single CSS file to multiple web pages, styling all of them with the same CSS style sheet. So we can add a new about.html, copy-paste all the content from index.html, change the text to about CSS, open the file in the browser, and you should still see blue colored h1 tag. So from one file, you can control the styles of your entire website. So these are the three ways to add CSS to an HTML document. Alright, with this in mind, the next thing we have to learn about is CSS selectors. A few minutes ago, I introduced you to the syntax of a CSS rule. It consists of a selector to select the element we want to style, followed by the style declaration. We learned that the style declaration is applied to every element that matches the selector. Now what we have here is called a type selector or an element selector, and is just one of the many ways to select an HTML element to style. Although this seems fairly simple, a complex web page contains a lot more HTML tags, and we need more ways to select the element we want to style. This is where CSS selectors come into picture. Now there are quite a few selectors, some more advanced than the others. So keeping in mind that we all are beginners, we're going to learn only the simple yet very useful selectors. The first selector is the element selector or the type selector, which we already have seen in our example. We specify an HTML element and the rule selects all of them in the web page. In our case, both the h1 tags. This is evident when we look at the browser. Both h1 tags are in blue color. The second selector is the universal selector, which selects every element in the page. The selector is denoted by an asterisk. So in styles.css, let me replace h1 by asterisk, and in the HTML, add a paragraph tag with some text. If we now look at the browser, refresh, and you can see every element is blue colored. Now the universal selector is mainly used to reset properties that the browser adds by default, which we may not necessarily need for our page. Pause the video and Google CSS reset to understand more about the topic. Alright, the next selector is the class selector. Sometimes you might want to style two elements differently. For example, in the HTML, I can remove the existing elements and add two paragraph elements. Red text as the first paragraph, green text as the second paragraph. Now we cannot use the element selector as it would apply the same style to both these paragraph elements. In such a scenario, we're going to apply a class attribute to both the paragraph tags. So on the first paragraph, class, and let's assign a value of error. Similarly, for the second paragraph, class, this is going to be equal to success. The values, of course, error and success are arbitrary, but they typically convey a meaning of style. But what this allows us to do is select these elements based on the class name. And the class selector starts with a dot. So in styles.css, dot error, and we set color to red. Similarly, dot success, and we set color to green. Error and success are the class names. If we now refresh the browser, we see the expected colors. Red text in red and green text in green. It is worth noting that using classes is probably the most common way to style elements in a web page. You would write the style for the class once and apply that same class to every element in the HTML you would want styled in a similar fashion. So make sure you have a good understanding of this selector. The next selector is the ID selector. It is similar to class selector, except it is used to apply to one specific element in the page, as ID is unique. So in the HTML file, create a new paragraph tag and add the ID attribute. ID is equal to test, and the paragraph text can be ID selector. Now the way to select this element would be in styles.css, the hash tag or pound symbol, followed by the ID, which is test, and then the style declaration. So let's set color to maroon. Refresh, and we see the maroon color. Now the ID selector is rarely used, but is useful when you have to target an element that already has some style applied, perhaps from an external library. We will talk more about how ID selector is more specific in just a bit. So element selector, universal selector, class selector, and ID selector. These are some of the basic selectors. Now it's possible to combine these to form advanced selectors. I'm not going to cover them in this crash course as it might start to overwhelm you. My recommendation for you is to thoroughly understand these basic selectors and then go to Mozilla Docs and learn combinators. They let you select elements in more sophisticated ways than what we have discussed here. For example, selecting a paragraph element only if it is within a div tag, or selecting a paragraph element only if it has an adjacent paragraph tag. Like I mentioned, it could overwhelm you as a beginner, so don't worry about it till you have a good grip on the fundamentals. Alright, now that we understand selectors, the next logical thing is to learn about style declarations. Let's take a look at a few properties which you are likely to use in your day-to-day work building websites. For our first property, let's continue with color. The value for color can be specified in multiple ways, and I want to showcase two of them. The first one is what is called a hex value. You're going to specify the hash symbol or the pound symbol, followed by a hex value that ranges from 6 zeros to 6 Fs. 6 zeros for black, as you can see right here, and 6 Fs for white. The other format is RGBA, where we specify red, blue, green values from 0 to 255, and finally the opacity. So RGBA 0, 0, 0 is black, and 0.5 can be the opacity, which will give you a less intense black color. Of course, the opacity can be varied from 0 to 1, 1 being more intense. Now, similar to color, we can also set background color for an element. In the HTML file, let's add two elements with a class. Div class is equal to orange, that says orange background, and a span tag class is equal to yellow, that says yellow background. In the CSS file, let's add a background color for both the classes. So .orange, we're going to set background hyphen color, which is the property name, to orange. Similarly, .yellow, which is the class selector again, background color, and we set it to yellow. If we take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the background color being applied. Orange being a div tag is block level, and yellow being a span tag is inline and takes up only the necessary space. So that is about the color and background color properties in CSS and a few ways you can specify the value. Our next focus is going to be around text styling. The CSS properties used to style text generally fall into two categories: font styles and text layout styles. Let's start with font styles. By default on Windows Chrome, the font is Times New Roman. If I inspect the element, head over to Computed and scroll down, you can see the rendered font is Times New Roman. We can change that using the font family property. Let me show you an example. In the CSS file, I'm going to create a new class called font styles. So font-styles with a dot at the beginning. I'm going to add the property font family and set it to Verdana. In the HTML file, I'm going to add two h1 elements, CSS text and again CSS text. But this time on the second h1 element, I'm going to add class is equal to font styles. If we now head back to the browser, refresh, you can see that the font is now different from before. Now, not every browser and operating system supports the font you might specify. So it is a good idea to add what is called a web-safe font as a backup font. And VS Code does a pretty good job of auto-completing web-safe fonts for a few font families. In styles.css, if I remove Verdana and type : again, we can select Verdana from the suggestions and VS Code gives us all the fallback fonts. Sans serif, which is the last one here, is pretty safe and is supported by all browsers. Now the next two properties are font style and font weight. You can specify font style, italic, and font weight, bold for italicized bold text. An h1 tag is bold by default, so as a quick exercise, I want you to create a paragraph text and apply the font styles class and verify how it appears in the browser. The next property is text decoration, and this you can set to underline. This will underline the text. Next, you have font size, which, as the name indicates, controls the size of the text. If we set it to 50 pixels, refresh, and you can see the text is way larger now. So font family, font style, font weight, and font size. These are some of the more common font-related properties. Next, let's take a look at text layout properties. First, we have text alignment, which controls how text is aligned within its containing box. For example, on the orange class, which is for the div tag, if we add text align and set it to center, refresh, you can see the text is at the center of the block. If you specify right, refresh, it aligns to the right of the container. The next property is line height, which sets the height of each line of text. So line height, and we can specify a value of 2. And this sets height to twice that of the font height. Refresh, and you can see the orange background is now taller. The next two properties are letter spacing and word spacing, which are used to control spacing between letters and words in your text. If we specify letter spacing to 4 pixels and word spacing to 20 pixels, refresh, you can see the spacing quite evidently in the browser. The letters are quite far apart and the words are as well. So text align, line height, letter spacing, and word spacing. These are some of the text-related properties and values you need to be aware of. Alright, next, let's quickly take a look at styling lists. In the HTML file, I'm going to add an unordered list. So ul tag, an li tag that says bread, and two more items, milk and eggs. Save the file and refresh the browser. You should see the list being displayed. The bullet point though is a solid circle. We can change this using the list style type property. On the UL tag, we can specify list style type, and disk is the default value. We can change it to circle to display a hollow circle. We can also set it to square to display a square. You can set it to none to remove the markers. But what you should note is that the list also has some default spacing. To remove that, we need to set two properties called margin and padding to 0. So margin 0, padding 0. We will learn about these two properties in a minute, but for now, keep in mind that you can remove the bullets from a list. In fact, most of the lists in a well-designed web page will not have a bullet point. This list style type of none is pretty useful. So that is a quick walkthrough on a few list-related properties and values with CSS. Our next topic is one of the more important concepts to learn in CSS, and that is the CSS box model. The box model mainly revolves around three properties: border, padding, and margin. Let's first understand the term box model. In web design, every element is considered a rectangular box. And understanding this box is the key to create layouts with CSS or align items with other items. The CSS box model is sort of a standard by which browsers render HTML elements. The box consists of four parts: margins, borders, padding, and the actual content. Let's visualize the four parts of the CSS box model. First, we have the content box. This is the area where your content is displayed, which can be sized using properties like width and height. Next, we have the padding box. The padding sits around the content as white space, and its size can be controlled using padding and related properties. Next, we have the border box. The border box wraps the content and any padding. Its size and style can be controlled using border and related properties. Finally, we have the margin box. The margin is the outermost layer wrapping the content, padding, and border as white space between this box and other elements. Its size can be controlled using margin and related properties. So content, padding, border, and margin. This is pretty much the CSS box model. With this explanation in mind, let's write some code to understand the different properties and how they affect the content being displayed. In the HTML, I'm going to add a div tag. I'm going to add the class attribute and set it to box model. The content within the div tag is going to be the text CSS box model. Now let's add the box model properties and understand how they affect this element in the browser. First, let's begin with a border. In the CSS file, specify the class box model, and we are going to set a property called border to 1 pixel solid red. Here, 1 pixel is the border thickness, solid implies a solid line, and red is the color for the border. If we save the file and take a look at the browser, refresh, you should see a red border for the div tag. Next, let's add a height and width. I'm going to set height to 50 pixels and width to 300 pixels. Save the file, refresh, and now you can see the content is a little taller and the width is 300 pixels instead of spanning the entire width of the browser. So height and width affect the content. Now let's take a look at what padding does. Let's set padding to 20 pixels. Refresh. And you can see that padding has added space between the content and the border in all 4 directions. So padding to add spacing between the content and the border. Very important to keep that in mind. Finally, let's add margin and set it to 20 pixels. Now this adds space outside the border in all directions. Refresh, and you can see the box is now displaced from its original position as there is space to the left and top of the box. We don't have elements to the right or bottom, but if we did, we would see spacing between those elements as well. Now, one thing you should learn when understanding box model is the developer tools support for it. So right-click and inspect element. If you now select the div tag, you can see the content is 300 by 50. There is 20 pixels padding. The border is 1 pixel in thickness, and there is margin of 20 pixels in all the directions. This is very useful when debugging your layout. Hopefully, you now have an idea of the box model, the different properties, and how they affect the element being rendered. These properties are very common when building web pages, so make sure you have a good understanding. Once you have a good grasp, I would recommend you learn a bit more about these properties. It is possible to add padding or margin in only one direction. For example, padding top, margin right, margin bottom, etc. So pause the video and try to figure out how to apply padding or margin only in the left direction. You can also take a look at the border radius property, which adds a curvature to the corners of the border. From a complete beginner's point of view, it is okay to gradually learn them, which is why I am suggesting it as homework in your free time. So that is about the CSS box model. Now the next set of topics we are going to learn might not seem like a big deal right now, but when you start working on projects, trust me, a good understanding will save you hours of debugging. The first of such topics is Cascade. The C in CSS stands for cascading, but we haven't really understood what that means, have we? Let's do that now. In the HTML file, I'm going to add an h2 tag that says Cascade. In the CSS file, I'm going to add 2 rules. An h2 selector, and the color is going to be red. And in the very next line, the same h2 selector again, the same property color, but this time with a value of blue. Both rules targeting the same HTML element, which is all h2 tags in the document. Now my question is, what do you think will be the color of the text Cascade? Pause for a moment and think about it. Refresh, and you can see the answer is blue. And this is the cascading rule. When 2 rules apply that have equal specificity, the one that comes last in the CSS is the one that will be used. Since the color blue appears last, that is the color which is applied to the h2 element. But in this slide, 2 very important words are equal specificity. But what exactly is specificity? Specificity is how the browser decides which rule applies if multiple rules have different selectors but apply to the same element. What you need to learn is that different selectors have different specificity. Let's understand with an example. In the HTML file, I'm going to add an h3 tag. The text content is going to be specificity. In the CSS file, I'm going to style the h3 element. So h3, curly braces, I'm going to set color to red. If we take a look at the browser, refresh, and we see red colored text. What you should know is that an element selector, like the one we have just defined, has the least specificity. But what is more specific than an element selector? Well, a class selector. So in the HTML, I'm going to add class is equal to subheading. In the CSS, I'm going to add a style with the class selector. So subheading is the class selector, and I'm going to set color to blue. If we now take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the color is blue. Now you might think, hey, isn't this just the cascading effect from before? The style that is specified last is being applied. Well, no. If I move the element selector to the last, head back to the browser, refresh, you can see the text is still in blue, which is the style from the class selector. So a class selector is more specific than an element selector. Similarly, we have an ID selector, which is even more specific. So in the HTML, we can add ID is equal to title, and in the CSS, add an ID selector. So the hash symbol, the ID is title. We're going to set color to orange. Take a look at the browser, refresh, and we see the text is now in orange. Of course, there is something more specific than an ID selector, and that is an inline style. On the h3 element, if we add style is equal to color :purple, refresh, and you can see the text is now purple. As you can see, we have different selectors with different specificity. When multiple style rules are applied to the same element, the browser will decide the most specific rule and apply that. Pretty simple if you're able to remember what is more specific. Of course, rules are sometimes meant to be broken, and CSS specificity is no exception. When we add the important keyword to a style declaration, it automatically becomes the most specific style. So on the element selector, if we add an exclamation and important, head back to the browser, refresh, you can see the text is now red. You can see that the element declaration is the most specific all of a sudden. Now you can see this important keyword being used in some code bases, but trust me, this is not the right way to add styles. The extreme case for using important is when you need to overwrite a third-party library CSS and you have no other way. When people say CSS is difficult, it is because they don't understand how specificity works. So make sure you spend some good amount of time on this topic, as it will benefit you a lot when working on larger websites that have a lot of CSS code. The final topic along similar lines as cascading and specificity is inheritance. You should know that some CSS property values set on parent elements are inherited by their child elements, but some aren't. You don't have to remember all the properties, but some, like color and font-related properties, are inherited by text. In the HTML file, let's add a div tag with a class called inheritance. Within the div tag, add a paragraph tag that says inheritance. In the CSS file, add a class selector for this inheritance class. Let's set color to orange and font family to Sego UI. Let's also set font size to 30 pixels. If we take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the paragraph text has inherited styles from the div tag. If I inspect this element, which is the paragraph element, it has a color of orange, font family of Sego UI, and font size of 30 pixels. The paragraph text has inherited styles from the div tag. So Cascade, specificity, and inheritance. I want you to come back to these topics when you get frustrated trying to understand why a certain style is being applied or not applied. Everything else we have learned so far is just the syntax of the language. These topics, however, are the core concepts you need. Hopefully, the examples we have just seen have given you a good idea. Next, let's move on to styling tables. Let me begin by adding the relevant HTML to display a table. And this is going to be the same table we had a look at in the HTML crash course. So table tag, t-head tag, and t-body tag. Within t-head, add a tr tag, and within the tr tag, I'm going to add 3 th tags with the text heading 1, 2, and 3. Within t-body, I'm going to add a tr tag again. And within the tr tag, I'm going to add 3 td tags with the text data 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to copy paste this row twice and change the text to data 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So a heading row with 3 columns and 3 rows for data in the table body. If we save the file and take a look at the browser, you can see the table being rendered. But this doesn't really look like a table, does it? So let's add some styles. Let's begin by adding a border. In the CSS file, on the th and td tags, let's add border, 1 pixel, solid, and a shade of gray. If we save the file and refresh, this still looks like individual cells rather than a table. To fix this, on the table tag, we add another property, border collapse, and set it to collapse. Refresh, and you can see it looks more like a table now. Sometimes you might want the table to take up the entire available width. In such cases, you can set width to 100% on the table tag. Refresh, you can see the table is wider now. Let's go with 60%. Looks much better. Next, let's talk about the alignment. By default, th tag is center aligned and td tag is left aligned. you can control that using the text align property. So just on the TD tag, we can set text align and a value of center. Refresh, and the text is now center aligned. Also, depending on the height of each cell, you can also control the vertical alignment. For example, below text align, we can set height to 50 pixels and vertical align to bottom. Refresh the browser, and you can see the text is now aligned at the bottom of each cell. I don't use this much, but it is something to be aware of. Next, to add spacing within the cell, we can add padding to TH and TD tags. So apart from the border, add padding 15 pixels and remove height and vertical align from TD. Refresh the browser, and you can see the table looks much better now. Finally, to make this look a bit more elegant, we can change border in all directions to just border bottom. So border bottom, 1 pixel, solid CCC. Refresh, and we see the separation of each row rather than each cell in the table. Of course, you're going to come across a variety of table styles when you start browsing websites, but these are some fundamental properties that you need to know as a beginner. Border collapse, width, text alignment, and padding for each cell. Alright, we have now covered styling most of the HTML elements. Now it's time to focus on some of the CSS properties which affect the layout of the web page. The first property is the display property, which specify if or how an element is displayed. In the HTML Crash Course video, I mentioned that every HTML element has a default display value. It can either be block, as in the case of a div tag, or inline, as in the case of a span tag, for example. Now you can also set the value explicitly when necessary. Let me show you an example. In the HTML document, I'm going to add 2 tags. A div tag with the text sample content 1 and a span tag with the text sample content 2. I'm going to add a class is equal to content1 on the div tag, and class is equal to content2 on the span tag. In the CSS, I'm going to add a simple border for both the classes. So content1 is going to be border 1 pixel solid red. And similarly, copy paste the style, change content1 to content2 and border color to blue. If we refresh the browser, you can see the div tag is a block level element and the span tag is an inline element. Now though, on content1 class, I'm going to set display inline, and this applies to the div tag. On content2, which applies to the span tag, I'm going to set display to block. If we save the file and refresh, you can see content1 is now inline and takes up only the necessary width, whereas content2 takes up the full width. So you can set display block or display inline. The third value that you should know as a beginner is display none. When I set on the content2 class display none and refresh, you can see that the element is not displayed in the browser. We see sample content 1 but not sample content 2. Now display none is a value typically used with JavaScript to show or hide elements. So block, inline, and none. These are the three display values that you must know as a beginner. Display, in fact, has a lot more values. Two of them, flex and grid, dictating how layouts are created in modern websites. But there is quite a bit to learn about flex and grid modules in CSS, which is why I will be creating separate crash courses on those topics. For now, make sure you understand block, inline, and none. The next property when it comes to CSS layout is the position property, which specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. There are 5 different values, so let's understand with an example. In the HTML file, I'm going to add 2 div tags. Position content 1 and position content 2. I'm going to add a class is equal to position 1 on the first div tag and position 2 on the second div tag. In the CSS file, let's add class selectors. So dot position 1, and let's set border to 1 pixel solid red. Similarly, position 2 is going to be border 1 pixel solid blue. Now by default, the position property for an element is set to static. So let's add position static to both the classes. With static position, elements are positioned according to the normal flow of the page. In our HTML, position content 1 is before position content 2. If I refresh the browser, we see the same. Position content 1 and then position content 2. We can affect or change this layout with the other position values. The second position value is relative. An element with position set to relative is positioned relative to its normal position. You can control that relative position with 4 other properties, namely top, right, bottom, and left. So for the first element, let's set position relative and top to 50 pixels and left to 50 pixels. If we take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the first element, which is position content 1, is now pushed 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left. So relative to its original position, it has been displaced by 50 pixels and 50 pixels. Now similar to top and left, you also have right and bottom, which have a similar effect but from the opposite direction. What's also worth noting is that position 2 element is not adjusted to fit into any gap left by the position 1 element. So we do have an empty space here. This is how relative position works. The third value for position is fixed, which positions an element relative to the viewport. On the second element, let's change position to fixed. We're also going to set bottom to 0 pixels and right 0 pixels. If we now take a look at the browser, scroll all the way to the top and refresh, you can see the element placed bottom right of the screen. But what is special with fixed position is even when I scroll, the element always stays in the same place. You would have probably seen feedback button or chatbot buttons in web pages, which are always positioned bottom right. The next position value is absolute. Now when I change fixed to absolute and refresh, the element is still positioned bottom right of the screen. However, when I scroll, it behaves differently to that of position fixed. However, if the element has a different parent element with a relative position, the position will then be relative to that parent element. That is slightly confusing, so let me show you the difference in the browser. In the HTML, I'm going to wrap the second element with a div tag and add a class called container. In the CSS, I'm going to add the styles for the container class. So container position is relative, width 200 pixels, height 2000 pixels. Border is going to be 1 pixel, solid, black. If you now take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the element is still positioned bottom right, but within the parent element. And this is something you're going to often use when developing web pages. Absolute position, but within a relatively positioned parent element. The final position value is sticky. An element with position sticky is positioned based on the user's scroll position. For this example, on position 1 element, set position to sticky. Now, if we take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see we have position content 1, but if we scroll down, it moves along with the scroll. Beyond an offset, it just sticks in one place. On a web page, if you have something that needs to be in the normal layout of the page and always visible as they scroll, position sticky is a very good option. As you can see, there is quite a bit to learn when it comes to the position property. We have position static, fixed, relative, absolute, and sticky. If it's a bit confusing at this moment in time, do not worry. It is something we all tend to struggle with as beginners. But hopefully the examples you have seen has given you a hint as to how the different values work, which should set you up for further learning. Okay, for the penultimate topic in this crash course, we're going to quickly take a look at the different CSS units. We have two categories of units, absolute and relative. Absolute units are generally considered to always be the same size. Here is a list of absolute units you can use. There are quite a few. However, pixel is the only value you will commonly use and is the value we have seen so far. Absolute units are useful for layouts where the page needs to be printed. Relative units, on the other hand, are relative to something else, perhaps the size of the parent element's font or the size of the viewport. The benefit of using relative units is that with some careful planning, you can make it so that the size of the text or other elements scales relative to everything else on the page. Here is a list of relative units you can use. Again, not every unit here is used regularly, but let us take a look at a few popular ones. Let's start with the first one, which is M. In the HTML file, I'm going to add a new element, div with a class called mContainer, and the text content is going to be munit. In the CSS, I'm going to define the style with a class selector. So dot m-container. We're going to set font size to 20 pixel and the height is going to be 2m. In this scenario, 1m is equal to the font size of the element. So 2m is 40 pixels. In the browser, if I refresh, you can see munit. If I inspect the element, click on computed, scroll down, you can see height is 40 pixels. Now M can also be used for font size on a child element. So in index.html, within the M container, add another div tag with a class equal to just M. The text can be M child element. In the CSS, on the M class, we're going to set font size to 1.5 M. What happens now is 1 M is the font size of the parent element, which is 20 pixels. So 1.5 M is 30 pixels. If we refresh and inspect the M child element, you can see font size is 30 pixels. As you can see, the M unit is a relative unit. The next unit to know about is rem. And rem is relative to the font size of the root element. Typically, that would be the body element. So in the HTML document, I'm going to add another div tag. The text content is going to be rem unit, and we also have a class called rem. In the CSS file, I'm going to add a style to the rem class where we set font size is 2rem. If we now refresh the browser and inspect the div tag with class equals rem, go to computed, you can see the font size is 32 pixels. Now 1 rem is equal to the font size of the body element, which is 16 pixels by default. So 2 rems is 32 pixels. If we set this to 3 rem, refresh, you can see font size is 48 pixels. Rem is a unit that is more commonly used to specify font sizes in a web page. So make sure you remember how this works. Alright, finally there is VH and VW for viewport relative height and width. Let's look at VH. On the rem element, I'm going to specify height 50 VH. I'm also going to set a border of 1 pixel solid 333, which is again a shade of gray. If we save the file and refresh the browser, you can see the height of the div tag is 50% of the viewport height. Now VW, which stands for viewport width, works on a similar principle but for width of an element. So M, rem, VH and VW. These are some of the more commonly used relative units in CSS that you as a beginner should be aware of. Alright, for the final topic in this CSS crash course, we're going to take a look at 3 math functions which can be used as property values. The first one is calc. On the rem element, for the height, I'm going to set calc 50 VH minus 100 pixels. When I refresh, you can see the height has decreased by 100 pixels. This is useful, for example, when you have to subtract the navbar height for calculating the available height for your content. The next function is the max function, which uses the largest value from a comma-separated list of values. I'm going to set height to max 50 viewport height, comma 600 pixels. When I refresh, you can see the height is 600 pixels as that is larger of the two values. It is also shown in the DevTools, as you can see. Similarly, if I change max to min, refresh, the height is reduced to 50% of the viewport height, as it is the smaller of the two heights. Both max and min can be used to set a minimum or maximum height or width for an element and allow it to take on the other value based on screen size. You might want an element at 500 pixels, but on larger monitors, it can take up more than 500 pixels, as it would be okay with more space on the screen. Well, with that, we come to the end of this crash course on CSS. If you're new to web development, I hope the video has given you an idea of how web pages are styled. If you have enjoyed the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content on web development. I'll see you in the next video, which is a crash course on CSS Flexbox.